37 years of loyalty ended in a 3-minute Zoom call. James Ellery stared at the screen, unable to process what he'd just heard. The HR rep, a young woman he'd never met in person, looked uncomfortable. "James, I want to emphasize this has nothing to do with performance. The company is restructuring, and your role is being phased out effective today." He blinked. "Today?" She nodded. "We'll provide a generous exit package and outplacement support." There was a pause. Then the screen flickered, and the call ended. No handshake. No thank you. Just silence. James sat at his desk, still dressed in his collared shirt and blazer, the same way he had for nearly 4 decades. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe for a moment. On his monitor, the company portal was already logged out. His email bounced back. His badge access? Deactivated. Just like that, he was out. By noon, his phone rang. It was Linda. "How was the call?" she asked gently. He hesitated. "I'm done." There was a beat of silence on the line. Then Linda whispered, "Oh." He didn't go into detail. Not yet. He wasn't ready to admit it out loud. That evening, he sat in the living room, staring at the family photos on the wall. There was one from the first company retreat in 1992, another from the sales award ceremony in 2007. His daughter Mia had drawn a picture once when she was 6, "My daddy helps people." It was still pinned to the fridge. Now he couldn't help but wonder what helping people was worth anymore. The next morning, James did what he always did. He woke up early, made coffee, sat at his desk. Except this time, there was no calendar invite. No inbox. Just a laptop, a blinking cursor, and too much time. He opened a drawer and pulled out his old business cards. James Ellery. Regional Director, Sales Operations. The stack was thick. Untouched. He used to hand them out like seeds, always planting future deals. Now, they felt like fossils. He placed one in his wallet, not because he needed it, but because he couldn't let go. That weekend, his son Kyle called from Seattle. "Hey Dad, how's the golf and retirement life?" James forced a chuckle. "It's early days. Mom says you're getting some rest, though." "I'm trying." Truth was, he hadn't slept. His body still woke at 5 a.m., like it had for years. But without purpose, mornings were just reminders of what he'd lost. On Sunday night, as he was sifting through personal files on his old laptop, he spotted a subject line buried deep in his inbox. "Are you still around?" It was from Terrell Hawkins, a client he'd worked with for over a decade. The message read, "Not gonna lie, James. Your replacement doesn't understand our business. I miss your steady hand. If you're still consulting, I'd love to get your take on a deal we're negotiating." James reread the message 3 times. Still consulting? He hadn't even thought about that. He wasn't consulting. He wasn't anything. But something in those words stirred him. Your steady hand. He leaned back, letting the message sink in. The words felt like an echo of the man he used to be. He looked around the house. At the silent coffee maker. The papers stacked neatly on his desk. The framed photo of him and Linda at the Grand Canyon, smiling like they had time. Was he still around? That night, over dinner, he finally told Linda everything. They didn't even say goodbye, he said. No exit interview. No recognition. Just, gone. She reached across the table and took his hand. You were never just a job title, James. He didn't respond. Not yet. But he heard her. The next morning, he sat down and drafted a reply to Terrell. Appreciate the message. I'm not officially consulting yet, but I'd be happy to take a look. He hit send. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a comeback. It was a whisper. But sometimes, a whisper is all it takes to begin again. James didn't expect much from that first call with Terrell. He thought it might be a favor. A courtesy. Instead, it was a test. I just need a gut check, Terrell said. We're negotiating with a new vendor, and I need someone who's not just trying to close the deal. James took notes on a yellow legal pad, the way he always had. It felt familiar. For the first time in weeks, the fog in his head lifted. By the end of the call, Terrell said, I'll send over a check. What's your rate? Rate. James hadn't even thought about charging. He mumbled, we can sort that out later, and quickly hung up. Afterward, he sat in his small home office, really just the guest room with the bed pushed against the wall, and stared at his laptop. Was this real? Was he in business? He scribbled on a sticky note, Ellery Advisory. One client. One chance. Linda peeked her head in later that evening. How'd it go? James shrugged, but his eyes gave him away. You look lighter, she said. I remembered who I was, he replied softly. But the high didn't last. His second client came 2 weeks later, a referral from a former colleague. It was a young startup looking for help with pitch strategy. James poured himself into it. Built a deck. Designed a plan. Gave them his weekends. And then, silence. No reply. No feedback. No payment. He emailed. Then called. Finally, someone responded, awkwardly, hey, sorry. We decided to go with a more current approach. Current. That word hung in the air like an insult wrapped in velvet. James didn't tell Linda. Instead, he sat alone that night, staring at the screen. Doubt crept in like a slow leak. Maybe he was too old. Maybe this world didn't need him anymore. He powered down his laptop. Closed the blinds. Went to bed early and said nothing. The next day, he considered letting it go. Maybe one client was enough. Maybe retirement didn't have to feel like failure if he stopped trying to prove otherwise. But then something unexpected happened. A handwritten card arrived in the mail. It was from Terrell's assistant, a woman James barely remembered meeting. It read, Thank you for treating us like people, not just numbers. I forgot what that felt like. That was the turning point. Not the money. Not the contract. The impact. James reopened his laptop. Rewrote his service offering. No fluff. Just clarity. Trusted guidance for growing businesses. Real strategy. No ego. He hired a designer to build a simple website. His daughter Mia helped him set up LinkedIn content and scheduled a few virtual networking events. One Saturday, they sat side by side, editing his bio. Dad, she said, squinting at the screen. You keep writing what you did. Try writing why it mattered. He looked at her. That's the difference, you know, she added. Between being impressive and being unforgettable. He rewrote everything that night. The next few weeks were slow, but steady. A podcast invitation came in from an old acquaintance. Then a panel discussion at a local business incubator. Then an invitation to guest teach a session on ethical sales practices at the community college. He stood in front of 25 students, none of whom had ever sold anything. Some were barely out of high school. One raised his hand and asked, What's the most important thing to know about sales? James paused. Then said, You're not selling a product. You're selling trust. And that only works if you still trust yourself. After the session, one of the students approached him quietly. A woman in her 50s, shoulders tense, eyes tired. I'm here because I got laid off after 20 years, she whispered. I didn't think anyone like me belonged in this class. But after hearing you, I think maybe I do. James didn't say anything for a moment. Then he smiled. You belong more than most, he said. Because you're not starting over. You're starting with everything they haven't learned yet. That night, James sketched out an idea in a notebook, Second Start Sessions, a free monthly workshop for professionals over 50 who wanted to re-enter the workforce, not as beginners, but as experts in transition. He didn't know if anyone would come. At the first session, 5 people showed up. By the third, it was standing room only. He looked around the room, gray hair, quiet eyes, hands that had built careers and raised families and signed mortgage papers. People who had been told their time was up. But they were here. Listening. Learning. Hoping. And James, standing at the front, didn't feel like he was teaching. He felt like he was coming home. The first local newspaper article called him the quiet coach. It wasn't flashy, but it stuck. A gray-haired man helping others find their way back to work in a world that had stopped looking in their direction. Within weeks, James was fielding calls from radio hosts, podcast producers, and career coaches from other states. His inbox filled with stories: people laid off at 58, widowed at 62, caregivers trying to re-enter the workforce after decades away. They weren't just looking for a job. They were looking for a reason to believe in themselves again. And James gave them that. The Second Start sessions grew. From a folding chair meeting in a library basement to a rented co-working space downtown. Some came just to listen. Others, to cry. A few, to begin again. He never charged. People asked why. James always gave the same answer: because someone gave me a second chance when I didn't believe I deserved one. But success brings notice. One afternoon, James received a LinkedIn message from a name he hadn't seen in over a year. Alex Norrington. His replacement. The message was short. James. We need to talk. I think I owe you a coffee. James ignored it at first. He didn't feel bitter anymore. He just didn't feel the need. But the second message came the next morning. I didn't know. About the buyout. About why they pushed you out. I didn't know they were using me to make it easier. I'm sorry. James sat back, arms crossed. The emotions stirred: anger, clarity, release, all tangled in a knot he thought he'd already unraveled. He didn't reply. But he thought about it. About how easy it is to replace people when you never bother to learn their value. That weekend, James spoke at a regional leadership conference. His keynote was titled, "Legacy isn't a position, it's what you leave in people." Midway through his talk, he told the room, I was pushed out at 60. Replaced by someone younger, faster, cheaper. But what they couldn't replace was this. He tapped his temple. 37 years of knowing what not to say in a sales meeting. 37 years of catching red flags before they became lawsuits. 37 years of looking someone in the eye and knowing when they were lying, because I had seen it all before. The crowd rose to their feet when he finished. But it wasn't the applause that moved him. It was the line of people afterward, men, women, all ages, who came to say thank you. Not just for the speech. For reminding them that they mattered. A week later, he received a certified letter in the mail. It was from the board of his former company. They wanted him back, as a consultant. To help them design a mentorship program for transitioning older workers and preserving institutional knowledge. James laughed. Not in anger. Not in spite. In awe. The same company that had let him go without a word now needed his wisdom to prevent their house from crumbling. He didn't say yes. Not yet. Instead, he brought the letter to his next workshop and read it aloud. After the gasps and laughter settled, he asked the group, "What would you do?" An older woman near the back raised her hand. "Take the money," she said, grinning. "Then build a bigger program." The room erupted. That night, Linda found James in the kitchen, reading that letter again. "You're going to do it, aren't you?" she asked. He looked at her, eyes thoughtful. "Not for them," he said. "For everyone they tried to forget." He accepted the offer, but on his terms. No office. No fixed schedule. And most importantly, full autonomy. Within 6 months, the mentorship program he built had spread to 3 other firms. Companies realized the knowledge walking out the door wasn't just files and passwords. It was people like James. People who'd seen cycles, built trust, navigated storms, without needing a Google sheet to tell them when to pivot. And then came the moment he never expected. At a national HR summit in Chicago, James was honored with the Lifetime Leadership in Workforce Equity Award. He stood on a stage, under bright lights, facing a room full of decision-makers who once would have ignored him. He took a deep breath, held the award in his hands, and said, "This isn't about me. It's about everyone who's ever been told they're past their prime. Everyone who's had their years of experience rewritten as liability. I'm not here because I fought back. I'm here because I stopped fighting to prove my worth. I started building something that proved it for me." A pause. Then he added, "They called it a layoff. I call it a release. Because once I let go of who I was, I became who I was meant to be." Later that evening, he and Linda walked by the riverfront, the Chicago skyline shimmering behind them. "You didn't just rebuild your life," she said. "You changed others." He smiled. "It wasn't about rebuilding. It was about remembering." "What do you mean?" "I thought I'd lost everything. But all I lost was a title. The man I've always been? He was just waiting for me to show up." She slipped her hand into his. The city moved around them. Horns, laughter, wind. Life didn't pause. And neither did he. The old library room smelled of paper and quiet. A chalkboard stood at the front, its surface worn smooth by years of erased lessons. Folding chairs lined up neatly, some with coats draped over the backs. It was the last second start session James would host, at least in person. He had announced it 2 weeks prior, quietly, during a regular Saturday workshop. "I'm not going anywhere," he had said. "But it's time to let others lead." Now, he sat at the front, sipping lukewarm coffee from a styrofoam cup, listening as a woman in her 60s introduced herself. "I was let go 3 months ago," she said, voice steady but eyes glassy. "They said they were moving in a new direction. I didn't know which direction I belonged in anymore. Then I found this group." She paused. "I just accepted a new job last week. I'm scared. But I'm not alone." James smiled. One by one, people spoke, not just about jobs, but about courage, about being seen again. A man who had once run a manufacturing plant was now mentoring local high school students. A woman who'd worked as a caregiver for 20 years had launched a part-time bookkeeping business. Near the end, a new attendee raised her hand. She looked nervous, her coat still on, hands fidgeting with the zipper. "I'm not sure I belong here," she said softly. "I used to be someone. Now I'm just drifting." James stood slowly and walked toward her, a familiar warmth in his voice. "Being someone doesn't end when a paycheck does," he said. "You still carry everything you've built. You're not drifting. You're realigning." She nodded, not yet smiling, but not sinking either. After the session ended, people lingered longer than usual. Hugs were shared. Emails exchanged. Someone brought cookies, and someone else played a bit of jazz on a Bluetooth speaker. As the room emptied, James remained behind. He picked up a notebook left behind on a chair. Flipping through, he found the first page. "I am not done." It was underlined twice. He held it in his hands for a long moment. Linda arrived just as he was locking the door. "Ready?" she asked. He turned, looking back at the room one last time. "Yeah. I think I've done what I came to do." As they walked into the golden light of late afternoon, she asked, "Do you miss who you used to be?" James glanced up at the sky, a pale blue stretching wide and open. "Sometimes," he said. "But I like who I'm becoming more." They didn't say much after that. Sometimes, peace doesn't need words. Sometimes, it's just knowing you didn't fade away quietly. You lit a path for others to follow. This isn't just James' story. It's the story of anyone who's ever been told, "You're done here." But instead of fading out, James lit the way forward, for himself, and for others. Now, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been cast aside, only to rise stronger? Leave a comment below and tell us your story. And if you believe in second chances. Comment 2 if you love this story, or 7 if it didn't speak to you. Don't forget to like, subscribe to EN True Tales. And join us every week as we share more unforgettable stories like this one. Because sometimes, the end is just the beginning.